Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie, where we discuss how regular women became Athenas in their own time by working hard, persevering through the challenges in their lives, and contributing to a better world. This is podcast 31. On today's podcast, we'll be discussing the book Little Chapel on the River, A Pub, a Town, and the Search for What Matters Most by Gwendolyn Bounds. In her book, Wendy shows us that it isn't all about having it figured out, but it's about learning how to transition. Just as when, after a storm, the tumultuous waves and the blowing wind give way to the sky's clearing into a new dawn. In upstate New York, the ocean's tidal pulse makes its way, rushing north nearly halfway up the river's 315-mile length with the flood current, only to turn hours later into an ebb current heading south. For much of the year, the ocean dominates, pushing its heavy salt front 60 miles up the river. But in the spring, the mountains claim the river, and the freshwater runoff holds the salt front back closer to the sea. The dueling led the river to originally be named the Great Waters in Constant Motion, or the river that flows two ways. Centuries later, it would be known as the Hudson. It is on this river where our story begins. In New York City, and in Garrison. Two different worlds, both along the one river. Garrison, Guinan's, and the Little Chapel on the River. The Hudson Highlands are a 15-mile stretch of land where the Hudson River slices below sea level through the Appalachian mountain chain. Garrison sits along the Hudson across from the more famous United States Military Academy, commonly known as West Point. It is said that Garrison is a state of mind. It doesn't technically exist. In late 2001, it still had no mayor, no town water, and wasn't big enough to qualify for official town status. Instead, it was a hamlet inside a broader area dubbed Phillipstown. It comes alive in the summer and quiets in the winter as the renters move back down south. Quote, "It is a 50-mile train ride from New York City's Grand Central Terminal and one of the last stops on the Metro North line bound for Poughkeepsie. Driving down the main road, you get a sense that somewhere along the line, somebody locked the gates into the commercial world and said, 'Thanks, but no thanks.'" End quote. The heart of Garrison is the river landing area where Guinan's is. Guinan's is unassuming from the outside. Quote, "To me, the ivy-cloaked stucco house doesn't look like much from out front. A giant rusting metal and glass payphone booth and a few scarred wooden benches occupy its front stoop. The listing gray mailbox says Guinan in peeling letters. A storm door is propped open, revealing a modest general store inside. Way in the back, in what our friend Jesse promises a bar, I see shadows of figures moving around. This is the story of a place, the kind of joint you don't find much around anymore. A spot where people wander in once and return for a lifetime. For most of its days, the place billed itself as a country store, but its true heart was the adjacent pub. There was a rusty horseshoe posted above one door and a gold shamrock embedded slightly off-center in the fireplace hearth. The floor slanted toward the river, and the men returned to the same seats every Friday. Most people called it Guinan's, after the Irish owner Jim Guinan. Some called it a bar. One regular patron christened it his Riverside Chapel, which seemed to me to be the best fit because for most of these guys, coming to Guinan's was something of a religion, with its own customs, community, and rites of passage. There was even a pastor of sorts, Jim, who on a good night could tell a story that might run as long as a Sunday sermon." End quote. Folks had been congregating at Guinan's quite a while before I showed up, quote, 42 years to be precise, which was long enough for the place to have a memory and a cast of characters as constant as the hourly trains rumbling by its windows. For them, the cramped space was far more than a pit stop on the way home. It was an extension of home itself. Guinan's was where they came after a death to toast and remember, on holidays and birthdays to pay their respects and buy a round or two, or on a late winter after afternoon when a cold wind made things lonely enough that you just needed to see a friendly face. When she was alive, Jim's wife Peg would welcome the men, scold them if their language turned rough, and offer supper to those who had nowhere else to be. Here inside this family's mismatched stucco green walls, it was always safe. The bar itself had a handful of stools. To the left is a stone fireplace with a little pile of white ash, probably left over from last year. A green neon Budweiser sign in the shape of a shamrock dangles from one window. The scratches in the red bar top are deep, revealing scarred wooden planks underneath. Plastered on the mirror above the bar are law enforcement badges of every sort: United States Marshal, FDNY Engine 73, San Francisco Police. There's also a white road sign with an arrow and the words OFF ALY 1. The smell inside the pub is something sweet and familiar of sugared donuts, bread, beer, and muddy marsh. In another room, I see a kitchen, clean dishes stacked next to the sink. See, some people call this place here a bar, he says. Others just call it Guinan's. I call it my Riverside Chapel. You call it a bar? I asked him. He chuckles. Yeah, I know. Great, huh? I took it from that Irish song, Holy Ground, he says. Leaning forward, further over his mom, who simply curls more deeply over her beer. There was a seaport section of Ireland called the Holy Ground. The song is about sailors and fishermen who dream of returning from a long journey to the pub, girl and girlfriends they left behind. It's like that in this place when I come back. End quote. Most of the men who come to the bar every night, or they come in with such frequency that their routines are known. And after a while, as Guinan's is their refuge, these routines provide their own comfort. Guinan's truly does become their little chapel on the river. Quote, when I stumbled upon this world in late 2001, I didn't know all of this was on the brink of disappearing. And I wasn't looking for a story. In fact, all I really wanted was a quick beer and to get back to New York City. What came next, upending my life because of this hole-in-the-wall pub, suffice it to say, was never supposed to happen. At least, not by any plan I'd laid out. End quote. So, Guinan's is this building, sort of this unassuming stucco building, and in the front is general store, and in the back is this pub where all these locals continue to congregate mostly every night, but they, just come there to hang out with each other. And it's sort of this hole in the wall and this really down home feeling. And you kind of just want to be there, with them. And the owner, and formerly his wife, but now just him, lives above the general store and the pub. And, again, you kind of just want to be there. And, Wendy, at the end of this little excerpt that I was reading from, she just kind of stumbled in here with her partner and her friend Jessie, who sort of lives in the area. And Guinan's ends up becoming a big part of her life, but you kind of wish you were Wendy.
Yeah, I found it like the more I heard and could envision like that setting, it was more and more attractive to me. And it had a very timeless feeling to it. It's very cinematic. It could almost, that environment could almost take place in any era. But, here we are talking about, right around 2001. And it just seemed like a real, like they say, it's home, it's safe, and it's a community. And it reminded me a lot of almost like what we were just talking about with the Bridge Ladies, this sense of community and honesty, and just kind of a place to, unload on your friends with no judgment. But it's a great setting to put in place for our story.
September 11th, 2001. The author, Wendy, and Catherine, her girlfriend, were in their apartment that overlooks the harbor in Battery Park City. To the left is the Hudson. To the right, the World Trade Center towers. The windows are open to catch the early morning air. They hear the impact of the first plane. And the second. Knowing that two could not be an accident, they grab what they can and they make a run for it, down 10 flights of stairs and out of the building. And they keep running. They hear the first tower collapse and the white dust that fills the air is suffocating. They keep running to the seawall. The second tower collapses. And then their lives change forever. They snuck back into their apartment building on September 12th to rescue their cat and to gather their passports and some emergency documents. It was the last time they would get back in for months. They camped out with friends for a few weeks and then lucked out and found an apartment rental for a month. Then they decamped upstate to stay with friends for a short period of time near Garrison as they continued to look for housing in the city. The housing market was tight, however, and they were having great difficulty in finding anything. As they continued to look, they were commuting back and forth from their friend's home to the Wall Street Journal's temporary offices, set up after their buildings were uninhabitable due to Ground Zero. But what was supposed to be a very temporary arrangement ended up being more permanent. After their friend Jessie took them to Guinan's that first Friday night, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, Wendy and Catherine were sucked into Garrison's charm and the chapel's congregation, and they rented a home in Garrison for the year. Over the next few years, Wendy and Catherine would use various commuting arrangements to get back and forth from Garrison to the city, sometimes staying in the city during the week and commuting to Garrison for the weekend. And then they never left. They eventually bought a home, continuing to make the journey back and forth. Maybe it was Guinan's, maybe it was something else. But the town became theirs, and they became permanent parishioners of the chapel on the river. And it was so impactful to read about their experience on 9/11 and the tranquility that they had and their normal routine that they were running through. I mean, they lived just basically feet from ground zero, and to see I mean, they could hear, the towers collapse, and then and hear the planes impacting, and just they ran, and then they gave a very Wendy gave this very descriptive view of what it was like to try and sneak back into their apartment to just grab the cat and grab what they could, and this instinctive feeling that she had that they weren't going to be able to get back in for a long time, and grabbing the emergency documents that they could. And then they basically became these vagabonds. They couldn't, they had nowhere to live. And then almost by luck ending up in Garrison, but it was like putting their life into this patchwork quilt.
9/11 is, of course, like kind of a new landmark of timekeeping. There's before 9/11, after 9/11, and events like this. Um, it's easy to talk that way, but I was not in New York City on 9/11, but it's amazing to see Wendy's life, how it really, there was the before and the after. And now as she kind of ventures into this unknown of what after really means for her and her family, it really, she has to, like you said, just kind of patch things together and almost take stock of what was most important and what maybe she wasn't considering as important before, and creating and rebuilding this new life for her.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because we talked about this, with Pam Houston's book, as she was in, Park City, and she moved around, and thinking, what is and isn't important in life. And I and what kind of life she wanted to create for herself. But you do, when you're under circumstances where everything is taken from you, and the life that you knew is no more, and you're faced with this, what am I going to do now? And who am I really? And what do I want? And, Wendy worked for the Wall Street Journal, and she and Catherine had sort of these, what looked from the outside to be these perfect picture perfect lives. And, they worked just blocks, not even blocks from their offices. And they were, caught up in the New York lifestyle. And she talks a lot about that. And now here they are in Garrison, and it's this totally different world. And for people who haven't been to New York City and then upstate New York, the area around West Point is nothing like the area around the area around New York City. And I read a short little sentence at the very beginning of the podcast about the fact that commercialization hadn't made its way up to Garrison. Yeah, it hasn't, as far as when I had last seen West Point, which is now a number of years ago. But it is an entirely different world. And so learning to adapt to that and really slowing your life down entirely. It's like going from 100 miles an hour to 10 miles an hour, and, making that conscious decision that you want to do that. And all of that being precipitated by an event that was unexpected and unwanted. That's something that you have to tackle, and it changes really your meaning and your purpose in life.
The Guinan Family. There are 4 adult children in the Guinan family, 2 of whom live still in Garrison and help out in the store, Margaret and John. Margaret is the eldest Guinan daughter and has been the lone woman on a police force in a neighboring town for 16 years. She has risen to the rank of detective, and though her rise through the all-male ranks could have left her jaded, Margaret's soft edges and quiet, introverted, purposeful demeanor suggests otherwise. She is unmarried at 48 and has no children. John is somewhat the opposite of his sister. He is instantly chatty and extroverted. He works a full-time job with the town's best arborist. John has a family of his own. About 5 years ago, Jim started having problems with his feet, complications due to his diabetes. At the time, the youngest Guinan daughter, Christine, and her husband were helping run the store. They have since moved to Florida. It is not easy helping Jim run the store. He wants nothing to change, no matter how sensible the changes. Christine and her husband wanted to first change little things and then to take cover and change larger things, but Jim wanted no changes at all. Frustrated, Christine and her husband left for Florida. John had wanted to take over the running of Guinan's when Christine did, but through a miscommunication that left a lot of hurt feelings, he had been left out. When Christine left, it had been up to his eldest sister, Margaret, and himself to pick up the pieces and help his dad run the store. But it was complicated. His dad didn't want to accept the help, and he still didn't want anything to change at the store. So John found himself opening the store every day at 4 a.m., and Margaret found herself working at the store every day during the day shift, neither of them having wanted to, nor planning on, working at the store as their career, but staying to do so out of obligation to their father. John handles the early shift at the store, rising at 4 a.m. to get ready for the 5:09 a.m. commuters. In the morning, when John arrives to get ready for the 5:09ers, he does things a certain way. Quote, writes some customers' names on their newspaper in the top right corner with a black lead pencil and lines them up under a reserve sign. He stacks coins and dollar bills on the counter so people can make their own change for papers and coffee and catch the train on time. He only uses one button on the rickety 1927 wooden Federal cash register, the one that opens and closes the drawer, and it requires a solid punch with the pointed finger. When the drawer gets full, John transfers the cash to rubber band packets and stuffs them temporarily into a wooden Carina Olay cigar box hidden in his dad's living quarters. He never uses a calculator. I never see him get a bill wrong. How did you do that? I inquire, after he's tallied a long list of items. How did you learn to add in your head so fast? Dad, he says again, he learned to do it playing darts, and he made all of us learn. End quote. Margaret's days last for 14 to 16 hours between her detective work and her work at the store. She never wanted to be like her parents, working at the store from 4 a.m. to close, but now she finds herself at the store when she isn't at a job. She, quote, tallies sales, orders new inventory, stacks soft drinks, restocks beer, slices fresh tomatoes and lettuce, sweeps the floor, carries out the trash, makes sandwiches, and rings up bubble gum and cigarettes, end quote. Margaret is the one to ensure that her father's foot bandages are changed and that his lunch and dinner are fixed. As the first year passes and then the second, and Wendy and Catherine stay in Garrison, Wendy becomes good friends with both Margaret and John and starts to help out at Guinan's. Then eventually starts working at Guinan's, helping out in the mornings and at night behind the bar. She becomes one of the family and, like a few others in the community, starts providing a patchwork quilt of working hours to free Margaret and John from having to hold down their full-time jobs and another full-time job at Guinan's. As Jim's feet continue to worsen, this patchwork quilt will save Guinan's from closing. John's relationship with Jim and Guinan's is complicated and decades long. He had wanted to take over Guinan's when Christine did, and that battle left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. Now, when his father's ill health had left him unable to continue taking care of the store and the bar, John had stepped up because, as he said, he was family, and Guinan's, it was Guinan's. But the company that owned the property wanted more than just a promise. They wanted stability. John offered to co-sign on the lease, but the company wanted a more complex business plan. John struggled to come up with what they asked for, but eventually submitted something. It was the beginning of the struggle for Garrison's identity, the long-standing community members versus the recently arrived city transplants. Garrison was teetering on the brink of changing from a sleepy rural town to a more trendy community, and those who loitered at Guinan's did not like the changes. It's such a, you realize when this history of the Guinan family and their establishment unfolds that it's like the centerpiece to this life for this family, but also this community. And, it's coupled with all of those seasons of life. Like now, Jim is ailing in his health and he can't even run the store anymore. So his children now are stepping in to take care. And, it's really, we're catching this, this kind of timeline 42 years down the road, but, we're seeing a lot of life, kind of set in as well. And I wonder what that means to Wendy at her point in life too.
Yeah, I mean, first to give the spoiler to our podcast audience, so you're not waiting until the end of the podcast, Guinan's does eventually close in 2008. But the adult children who really, in essence, they never wanted this for themselves. And, I think it's an interesting thing. And, we talked a little about it in the Bridge Ladies last week, but their daughters didn't want to become like their mothers either. They wanted something else for themselves. And you kind of hear it, with the Guinan children, they wanted other careers. They didn't want to run the general store. They didn't want to run the pub. And yet when their mom and dad, especially their dad, couldn't handle the store anymore, they were right there. Because in some ways that's just like, that's what families do. You just step up and, you come and help with the family business, or you take care of your parents when they're ailing, and it changes your life plans. You may have wanted to do whatever your aspirations were, but I think families who are close, I don't know. I think that's what families just do. And it's complicated, and it may change your trajectory, but I don't know. I I watch it in my own family, and I don't know if it's tragic. I wouldn't call it tragic. I would call it love.
Well, and I think Wendy entering into this time of Margaret and John's lives, it seems almost like they've been handed a challenge that maybe they didn't expect or they didn't think was possible, having to run the store, but they're stepping up. And Wendy and Catherine were handed this challenge, as the whole nation was, but their lives are uprooted, and so they're actually, now that I think about it, they're kind of their paths are crossing at a time when they maybe both are trying to, transition and adjust to these challenges that have been placed in front of them that they didn't ask for.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of similarities between the Guinan adult children and Wendy, and I think maybe that's what she can relate to John and Margaret with, is everybody's sort of going through these transitions at sort of the same period of time in their lives, and they're all kind of searching for their identities as well, right? I mean, everything has been disrupted in their lives. And so they're kind of searching for, who am I, and what do I want, and moving forward, who am I going to be? And sort of, again, they're looking for this meaning and purpose. And Margaret's meaning and purpose has always been her police work, but what's it going to be now? And John's has been his job and his family, but is his future to be Guinan's? Is that what it's going to be? And it turns out it's not. But I think those are all really hard decisions to make, and especially with Guinan's being such a big part of the community. I think that those decisions end up being influenced by others, and you wonder, should they be influenced by others, or are those decisions that they need to make independently? And those, again, those are really, really tough calls. Wanting to belong. Quote, "After that first Friday night with the parishioners, I wanted in. Wanted to be part of what was going on there at Donnery's so-called chapel on the river. Throughout the winter, I dropped by in the mornings to sit with John, and in the afternoons to try and catch Margaret in a talkative mood. Friday nights, I drove straight to the bar from work in New Jersey, climbed onto one of the 5 stools in the back, and sipped the Coors Light Jane handed me, while waiting for Catherine to drive from the city by train. While waiting for Catherine to arrive from the city by train. Here's the thing. Up until this point, I had never really belonged to anything except maybe my job. No church, no volunteer groups, and forgetting one hapless year of getting my head bashed in boxing, not even a steady sport." End quote. It wasn't that Wendy wasn't an achiever. In fact, it was quite the opposite. She always knew where she was supposed to be headed, and she had sent her internal compass there, beginning in high school. She'd begun climbing those first rungs of the proverbial ladder, being voted most likely to succeed. She had plenty of close friends, but by the time she was writing the book, she realized she hadn't kept in touch with any of them, and she had kept climbing. Unlike her parents, who had somehow managed to find the elusive balance between their careers and hobbies, her father, a veterinarian and mechanical mastermind, who could play the drums, ride a motorcycle, and navigate by the stars, and her mother, who could teach Spanish, catch a fish, and clean and cook too, Wendy never found that balance. While their parents could disconnect, Wendy always found that clock ticking, and she continued to chase that next goal. By her mid-20s, she had sewn up the basics of life she had thought she had wanted: living in Manhattan, writing about fashion for the Wall Street Journal, renting an apartment in a high-rise across from work. Interviews with the top fashion icons of the world, dinners in the top restaurants, parties with top celebrities, falling in love with Catherine, another hard charger who understood late deadlines and weekend work. And the idea of sitting quietly and doing nothing just disappeared. If she arrived early for dinner, there was always her cell phone to keep her busy. There was never enough time for her to do everything she wanted. It wasn't really her job, it was the way that she worked. And her internal clock constantly ticking away, dictating her life and leaving no space for anything else. She wasn't oblivious to time passing. As she discusses in the book, she saw all the birthdays, the family milestones. Sometimes she would pause and think about slowing down, taking a sabbatical just to catch her breath. But, quote, once you're in the professional game, constantly moving towards the next goal, how do you suddenly call it time out and not get benched altogether? I'd assure myself there'd be time to have it all, just later. Then I'd go back to my desk, make one more phone call, answer one more email. That was the thing about Guinans. There I watched two grown children working themselves into exhaustion for no other payoff than to keep their parents' legacy alive. Meantime, I had the river and the stately mountains to put my busy little existence into perspective. The place was unhurried, the visible seasons outside a truer and more sane clock. Inside these walls, I never thought about where else I needed to be or what else I needed to be doing, and I hadn't felt that way in a long time. End quote. So I connected with Wendy here. I have been climbing this ladder my whole life. I can't remember when I wasn't climbing this ladder. I mean, I've always been on this ladder. And in 2015, I made the decision to get off the ladder and move, much like Wendy did, to a place that didn't have this proverbial ladder. At least it wasn't going to for me, because I wanted to have balance. I wanted to, although I was recently listening to a different podcast, and the guest on the podcast called it integration and not balance. And I really like that term, integration. So I use it now. But I wanted to find that integration into my life of both work and living life. And, I love it. I love that my life isn't run by work. I love that I can have everything, a little bit of everything. It's not perfect. It's not perfectly balanced or integrated, but no longer is it run by that clock. No longer is it, 15-hour, 18-hour work days. No longer is it work then anything else if you can fit it in. And so for people listening who are work focused or career ladder focused, there's nothing wrong with that, but you've got to remember either to find that integration or to remember, or to know that there's an end to the ladder. You can't stay on that ladder forever. You've got to find some integration in your life, because life is going to just pass you by otherwise. And I was reminded of that recently, when my balance got off. I had sort of lost it. I had let myself it wasn't a ladder I had let myself get on. I let myself get on like a treadmill. And as a result of that, I had completely lost that integration again. And so, you just, if you don't focus on it and you don't remember to maintain that balance or that integration, and you are somebody that is used to that ladder climbing, you will slide right back into that habit. So, again, I would just urge people, as we're talking about these women, if you connect with somebody like Wendy, to just really do that sort of introspection look at yourself, go on a walk, take that little me time and start thinking to yourself, is this really what I want long term? And I'm not saying go to work on Monday and quit your job. Not saying that. Or if you're listening to this some other day, don't go to work and quit your job. But maybe you want to start thinking about an exit strategy, so that you can, have that life.
Yeah, I too could relate to, this idea of almost like it's like the ambition of career. And I've been in my career now, I guess, 11 years. And, in the beginning of that, it's like you just kind of eat it up and you like go, you just every opportunity that you can have to grow or to take on more responsibility. I was doing that. And, then I got married and I could still keep that pace up. And then it's almost like as life continues, that pace of that ambition, I think naturally kind of has to, I don't know, for me, it's almost like slows down because there's other important things that come in, whether it's an evolution of perspective, and your eyes start to open up. Oh, okay. Well, I want that community, or I want to carve out that time to be healthy, or, oh, I'm going to have a kid. And, priorities can kind of change. And almost like, I feel like like you talk about this treadmill, but it's almost like it forces that treadmill to go on an incline or um, a little bit slower, because you're now carrying more of these balls in the air and spinning more plates. And so I definitely have been relating to that. And you know what it struck me about like all these modern Athenas that we've been talking about, I was so reminded of Joan Anderson and the Year by the Sea that she took, and how that she kind of got a chance to see this in community that Wendy's witnessing at Guinan's, and Ariel Levy, who was kind of going, on that very ambitious path of career, and then life's heartbreak was kind of starting to, push her different directions. And, I think maybe that is a tendency of these women that we've been talking about, is that we're all on these paths where we're very focused and on what we want to achieve, and then what it's at different points there's these roadblocks that are kind of thrown in our way. And I guess what I'm trying to take away from all that is, do we have to wait for those roadblocks and those external challenges to be thrown in our path to stop and think about what we want out of life? And it seems like those are hugely beneficial catalysts, but at the same time, we don't know how long any of us has. So in each and every day, should I be asking myself more like, okay, what do I want to get out of today, as opposed to just keep my head down on my to-do list and my obligations? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because I think we all are dreamers. But I think that we also are realists. And so I think there's a place and time to dream. And I think we need to, because I think that waiting for those big catastrophic, unplanned and unexpected events, I think if we wait for those, then some of us are never going to have them. And others of us are going to have them again when we least expect them. And then we're ill prepared for them. So I don't think you want to wait for those to happen. So I think you need to have them yourself, and induce them yourself, in the sense of you need to make things happen. On the other hand, you still need to make your day-to-day life happen while you're sort of planning for them. So you need to do your tasks. You need to have everything happen. So I think you need to balance both of those things. But I also think you brought up a critical point of perspective. If you have gone through a major life event, you've got a different perspective on things, and the little things no longer are, bother you. They're no longer as important. You want more out of your life. You're looking for meaning and purpose that's bigger. And so you're more willing probably to take risk, to try newer things, to go outside of that comfort zone than you would have been before. And so, like you're saying, I would encourage people to try those things before you have a major life event that causes you to try them, and just be open to possibilities. It's scary to take risk. It's scarier to be forced to take risk. And so again, create an exit strategy out of wherever you are now. Don't just jump because you want to. Create that strategy, create that financial buffer for yourself and your family. Get the resume together, send it out, get the new job before you leap. Because the worst thing you can do is get pushed off the cliff and have no net.
509ers. Quote, the 509ers, as they're called, are the Navy SEALs of commuters. They are either the bravest or the craziest members of the working world. Their days begin in the pre-dawn hours when country dark is heaviest. Out here, most roads don't have streetlights. When late-night traffic has ceased, there are no perpetually vigilant skyscrapers or careening taxicabs to lend the aura of company, end quote. Stacy Gibson, a manager with a major New York pharmaceutical company, is the equivalent of the 509 Crew's Command Master Chief. She awakens at 2:30 a.m. to walk her 5 dogs. Then she walks on her treadmill for an hour, showers, dresses, and at 4:50 a.m. reports to the little chapel on the river. Quote, there she is joined by the rest of the troops, among them a hunky New York City cop and a doorman for the Palace Hotel. If the papers have arrived, the 509ers help John carry the stacks inside. The hour is odd, disconcerting. Everyone there knows it's not exactly normal to be awake so long before the sun comes up. Here in the store, though, they are not alone. The lights are on, a pot of fresh coffee is brewing, and they can talk in regular voices. Here, the early hour is just a little less strange. At 5:08, they move to the train platform, splitting up now, end quote. At 5:09, the train arrives, swallows them up, and departs. There are unwritten rules at this hour. No one talks on the trains. The train moves south, arriving at Grand Central Station at 6:15 a.m. There, the 509ers deposit Guinan styrofoam cups and buttered roll wrappers into the blue waste bins and emerge into the frenetic streets. So, I think I was born a morning person, which people love or hate, I think, the idea of morning. I think I've always just functioned much better in the morning. And so I really could kind of envision what it would be like to be these 509ers. And it is a strange camaraderie, but there's something very comforting to people who are morning people, maybe, waking up in those hours before dawn. And it's a very like it's a moment of solitude, before you kind of, I can imagine, before they would get to Guinan's. But there's something strangely comforting that there's other people out there that are all getting ready for the day. And so I don't know, I could see myself being a part of this crew.
This would definitely be my crew. I also am a morning person, to a fault. Although now I also enjoy the late evening hours, so I'm almost this like nocturnal creature where I could definitely do like 8 p.m. to about 10 a.m. And then just sleep the rest of the day. But they definitely are like this well-oiled machine, this like team, and I love that sort of spirit. I love like an early morning team or group. I could definitely fall into that. When I used to live in the Bay Area, I had a 5 a.m. CrossFit group. I mean, we were religious CrossFitters at 5 a.m. and it was awesome. I mean, we were motivated. We were motivating each other. It was the same people, by the way, because you do have to be a little bit crazy to go to 5 a.m. CrossFit. But it was a perfect way to start the day. And by 10 a.m. you were tired, but you had done more in your day than most people do by 10 a.m. than most people do by 3 p.m. And yeah, it's solitude in the morning, but you also feel like there's something special about it, and every day you see the dawn, and there's just really something awesome about seeing dawn. When you know that you're part of the community, quote, early on, everyone at the bar was a two-dimensional snapshot. I was initially just that girl, the blonde, the writer. I was in these days sometimes the only woman who showed up regularly. At first, my presence inspired awkward silences or mumbled apologies when someone told an off-color joke, at which point a guy might have given me a look, like, had enough yet? But I hadn't, and so I kept showing up. Week after week, I'd see the same faces. As the tiny place slowly made room for me, old Mike remembered my name, and Jane eventually greeted me with hugs. Ed, the eldest of the two Preusser brothers, began finding room for me next to him at the bar, and Fitz kept calling me the Gwendol and elbowing me when he thought I wasn't paying proper attention to his stories. So it was that, with these endorsements, with each round of just one more, I faded a bit more into the woodwork, until finally, instead of a raised eyebrow or some nervous guy offering me a stool when I walked in, I got nods and the conversation continued uninterrupted. And that's when the snapshots started to come alive. End quote. So here's Wendy, who had never really been part of a community before, finally fitting in and finally feeling a part of something. And everything then starts to change for her, and you feel this sort of, that she's finally feeling a sense of belonging and honestly like a sense of home. And it's made me feel all like warm inside and kind of like warm and fuzzy for her. And I know that feeling, and it is an awesome, awesome feeling, especially awesome for people like her and I who have been on this ladder and who don't usually get that because we're so focused on climbing.
Well, and I think it shows that, like, wholesome friendships happen organically. And you can choose to be part of a community, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make long lasting friendships. I mean, I'm sure we've all been in those cases, and I think I've felt that way too. And it's almost like those wholesome friendships come in those unexpected places, and you have to kind of let them just unfold. And she was, it took time for her to become part of that community, but she just made the right, she made genuine choices. And she trusted others, and they started to trust her. But at the same time, it feels like that's not necessarily that's kind of an extraordinary thing that happens in life, but it's so beneficial when it does. And you know, my closest friends, you, Debbie, and you know, others, that the friendship just kind of came out of almost nowhere, and you just kind of let it happen, and it really takes shape in a meaningful way.
No, I totally agree. And I know we've told this sort of story. I think we've told the story of how Sonia and I met before, but it was in this like book signing line. And it's not like we anticipated it happening. And I think it was the same sort of feeling. It just happened. And it's this awesome, awesome thing. So yeah.
It feels like a gift in a
Oh,
way.
it
Like it's
definitely
just
feels like a gift.
and so it's just cool that she's found this you know, she's been drawn to this community, but she almost didn't know what she was going to get out of it, and she's gotten a lot. William Fitzgerald. Quote, a guy like Fitz is the lifeblood of a place like Guinan's. If nobody else is offering much interesting, a guy like Fitz will provoke them until they do. He considers provoking his duty, in fact, just to keep things from getting boring. He's proud of it too. Call them what you will, troublemakers, loudmouths, a real pain sometimes, but without Fitz and Lala, a Guinan's or a Shannon's becomes as polite and predictable as TGI Fridays, one step from a fern bar. Owners love them, or at the very least tolerate them, because while these guys are holding court, people stick around and drink more, if only to get a word in edgewise, end quote. So this reminded me of my brothers, you know, those people in your life that never let you take yourself too seriously, which for me was very important as a young woman. I took myself incredibly seriously, and my brothers let me know it. And so when they'd poke fun at me or whatever, I would get really upset because, you know, I was a very serious person. So it's so important to have these people in your life, I think, because they keep that humor and really humility in a circle and an environment. And it really, I think, helps to contribute to that balance if you're able to laugh at yourself, because it promotes longevity in your life too, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I had a friend in college who did this and always made me laugh. Because I'm not this way. I definitely get too serious. I definitely get too focused. I definitely analyze. I study a lot, and so I generally tend to forget to have fun. And so I think that having these people is a good counterbalance to sort of maintain that, I think is important.
Ed Preusser. Ed Preusser is 33. Wendy ends up striking up a conversation with him many evenings. Although he's only 33, there seems to be nowhere else he would rather be at night than to be at Guinan's striking up conversations with all the old timers. Because Ed, he, quote, prefers sleepy Phillipstown and the company of the pub's crew, wanting nothing more, it seems, than the cards dealt to him. He already knows more or less the trajectory of his life will take and exudes a deep-set contentment that I've never known. Ed resides in his parents' cottage, and he knows he will move into the main home when they pass on. He can rattle off the names and legacies of all his ancestors down to the fact that his grandmother died smoking a Salem menthol cigarette in her own bed. He also knows where he wants his own death to lead, to a burial plot he's picked in advance. My initial instinct is to brand such complacency as laziness, except that I soon realize Ed is proficient in ways most people my age aren't these days. Things I have to hire someone to do, he does himself. Fitz calls Ed an old soul, and Ed takes it as a compliment. Ed also wants to be married and to see the next road his life will take in the faces of his children. But he's waiting for someone who understands his way of life, someone who can settle in this small town without feeling like they've settled. End quote. It's hard to explain, he says one cold night, leaning against the wall with his harp, face lit up by the flickering fire. Quote, obviously I don't come here to pick up girls, because there usually aren't any. It's not about the food, because there isn't any of that either. It's just this calm place where everybody's telling stories and some guy who's a millionaire stockbroker is sitting next to a poor carpenter, and they're equal. You either love it or you hate it. The woman I bring to Guinan's, he says, looking me straight in the eyes, is the woman I'll marry, end quote. I thought this was, again, kind of a poignant moment to this description of the stockbroker sitting next to the carpenter. And it really just gives even more depth to the community that's here at Guinan's, that they don't all, a true community doesn't have to all look the same. And I think in a lot of ways, the communities that are set up around us can have, they can look all the same. And I find that in those that I've sought out that do look like me, or do look like what I'm, trying to think I need to find, isn't where I've actually found the community. It's in these situations where the variety and the common thread is kind of that desire for relationship, is really where it is. So it's almost like we have to take a second look at what is that community that we're looking for. Is it what looks like us, or is it what really is going to be the true source of relationship?
Yeah, and I also think that, sometimes we're so anxious to, people want a partner who makes good money, or a partner who's a doctor, or a partner who's this or that. And you know, I think Wendy's making a point too in the book that sometimes you're looking for the wrong thing. Sometimes someone like Ed, you want a partner like Ed. Ed knows he's steady. He knows how to do a lot of things. He's a great guy. He's gonna be a great husband for somebody, or a great partner for somebody. And just because he's not a doctor, just because he's not going to make $800,000 a year, doesn't mean he wouldn't be a great life partner for you, and doesn't mean that your life wouldn't be completely more fulfilling than if he was making $800,000 and a doctor and never at home and not emotionally there for you and not supportive. So sometimes you're looking for all the wrong things in all the wrong places. And so I think Wendy's saying, open your eyes a little bit, and you may never know what you're going to find around the next corner or in the next pub. Stealing time. Quote, at 8:30 p.m., I can't understand where the hours have gone. Later, I will come to believe that this place steals time, makes it impossible to be anywhere else punctually, because of some magic grip it holds over those inside. The pace was unhurried, the visible seasons outside a truer and more sane clock. Inside these walls, I never thought about where else I needed to be or what else I needed to be doing. I hadn't felt that way in a long time. End quote. So inside the pub, Wendy really doesn't feel time. And for the first time, you really see her slowing life down. And, earlier we'd read this quote about her, checking her phone at dinner. In essence, she never slowed life down. And now you're seeing her finally almost breathing, for the first time. And it's metaphorical, in a way too, but I think everybody needs to find that place in their life. It's not going to be a pub necessarily, but that place that they can go, physical, mental, emotional, where they can breathe. And I think that that's so important. And when you do that, you're going to be able to see things that you couldn't otherwise see.
I totally agree. I think those moments, those conversations, the activity, whatever it is, can kind of recalibrate your own self and also give you an opportunity to reconnect in a meaningful way. For me, that could be some sort of physical activity like a hike, where you're out in nature and all you're thinking about is the activity you're doing. I love those types of activities where like the bridge ladies talked about it, like they only think about bridge when they're actually playing cards, and they really protected that time. But and also just family gatherings, which I have a lot fewer of. I was actually supposed to be traveling for Labor Day weekend to see family, but the storms that have been rolling through kind of prevented that. And but those times kind of seem to slow down time, and you can't live that way. You can't live away from your responsibilities, and you have to make money, and you have to do what life needs you to do. But I think making sure that there is still those times as often as you can make them is of such importance.
And here are some final thoughts for today. Whether they were a 509er or they had a paper with their name on it on the counter, or they sat on a stool with a beer in their hand, what brought people to Guinan's was a sense of community and belonging. For the 3 minutes or 3 hours that they were within those green stucco walls, time stood still for the parishioners of the little chapel on the river. Time waited on them. I think that all of us want to be a part of a community like Guinan's. The problem is that we often believe that we simply don't have the time. The tick-tock of life begs us to keep moving, and we lose those precious moments each day that we could enter our own building of green stucco walls and coffee pots and coolers of beer. We look longingly behind us to times when we were younger, when we were natural community builders, when we belonged to each other and to our collective fairy tales, imaginations, and hopes for the future. When we played in the streets with the neighborhood kids until we were called in for dinner, when we were in college and we spent time with our friends in our dorms, at parties, or in clubs with such important purposes as the Society of Journalistic Freedom. Those communities were as much a part of us as our families. Those communities were our families. As we grew up and started traveling down the road of life, the mile markers began to pile up. The tick-tock of the clock of daily life plays in the background like a metronome, and the only thing we can do is grab the fabric flag that flies atop each mile marker in the hope that we will be able to use it in the future to somehow remember that moment by. We rush past opportunities to build new communities, too busy to pause, too busy to even look. We don't have the time to build lasting friendships, to implant roots, or to create our own church services like they have at Guinan's, because as the metronome keeps reminding us, time does not wait for anyone. Occasionally, we will have moments when that metronome comes to a temporary stop. The birth of a child, the death of a loved one, a car accident, a surgery, a wedding. In those moments, time does seem to stand still. We seem to pause and take stock of where we have been, of what we are doing, of where we want to go. We promise ourselves that we will take life slower, that we will take more time for ourselves and for our family. And sometimes we even start to look at all those fabric flags that we have grabbed, wondering how they fit together. But all too soon, we once again hear the metronome's tempo pick back up, and we force ourselves to pick up speed once more, careening down the road, quickly putting distance between us and that one moment when time stood still. All we know how to do is drive, and so we do, year after year after year, collecting the fabric flags, racking up dozens of miles, continuing to speed down that road. Eventually, the years on the road turn into decades, and our lives begin to change. The metronome no longer needs to keep its presto tempo, and so it slows down to a much calmer adagio, and our speed on the road slows too. Our children have their own children, our careers have ended, and our mile markers no longer have fabric flags. Instead, we find ourselves on our porch, settling into our rocking chair, staring out over the Atlantic, thinking of all the years gone by. We occupy our time by sewing a quilt together of all the individual fabric flags we have gathered along our road. Most of the flags are now discolored, folded, and stained, the edges worn and frayed. As we sit on the porch and slowly sew them together, each one bringing a smile to our face, reminding us of that mile marker, that moment in our lives. Yet, we are also a little sad. We wonder what could have happened if instead of that one little fabric flag, we had a whole quilt of fabric for that one moment in time. A quilt full of love, of light, of laughter, of happiness, of community. Maybe then we would have so many quilts that we could give them to all of our grandchildren and share with them the memories of all the communities we had been a part of. Maybe then we could have passed along something far more important than our worn-out metronome and a single quilt of worn fabric flags. Maybe then we could have passed on the knowledge that it isn't about how many fabric flags you can collect, but it is instead about how beautiful each quilt can be, about how many lasting friendships you can make, about how deep you can implant roots, about how fulfilling your church services can be, just like they are to the parishioners at Guinan's. So, don't let the metronome speed carry you down the road of life too fast. Take time every few mile markers to get off the road and sew a quilt. You will be very glad that you did. And on that note, that's all we have for today. So thanks for listening to the story of the Guinans and sharing this experience with us. You can interact with us, follow us, and learn about upcoming episodes on our website at modernathenas.com, on our Facebook page under Modern Athenas, on our Twitter at Modern Athenas, and our Instagram at the Modern Athenas Podcast. We would also appreciate if you support our podcast by leaving us a review on iTunes or Stitcher and subscribing to the podcast. In our next podcast, we will be discussing the book Waiting by Deborah Ginsburg. As we leave you today, we want to remind you to never forget that each of you, like all the modern Athenas we have discussed on our podcasts, has the power and capacity to be a change maker in your world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.